And this is a time that I said that we would do a little talking together. So to honor your time, and first of all, thank you so much for coming. I'm just really thrilled to see friends. Come on in. I thought that I would begin by sharing with you a little bit about how the book came to be, what it's about, and then, if you don't mind, read one or two samples to kind of illustrate what I'm trying to do in the book. And a couple of years ago, I was, like many of you do, looking for sort of a spiritual challenge for the year, and oftentimes, I'll read the Bible through in a year using one of the Bibles as formatted for daily reading. And so I decided I would do that, but this time I would post online a little blog about what I read each day. So I decided to do this, and then about a week later I said, what am I thinking? When am I going to do this? I don't have any time to do this. So I decided not to do it. And then one night, and this has never happened to me before I can remember, I woke up wide awake about 2 in the morning with a very clear impression on my mind that no, I should do this. And it was quite startling because I say this doesn't happen to me, and so I took that as God telling me to go ahead and do it. And so I talked with Joy about that and the sacrifice for her, because it would mean every single day I would have to take an hour or two to do the reading and do the thinking and write the blog. That's days off, vacation days, everything. And she was very supportive, thank you, honey, to make that happen otherwise. And so usually it was between 10 and midnight that I was doing my writing. And I found in doing it, it was very encouraging to me. I really had chose to do it for my own benefit, to force me to, engage the text, the story again, and try to communicate what's going on there in a way that a person that's tried to read the Bible but given up because it was too difficult could make sense of. Or for a person that was curious about the Bible but never read it before. So that's kind of how it went. And so as the year went on, I had good feedback online with people, and it became something I looked forward to every night to do. Even though at times that particular year we took a vacation time to see friends in Germany, while on the plane in this little tiny seats, with my notebook out and the Bible open trying to write. And so towards the end of the year, I live in Poulsbo, if you don't know, pastor a church there, and I went to Poulsbo Chamber of Commerce, and that particular day was a presentation by a local publisher, Kissat Publishing, and Ingemar Anderson made the presentation. He is here. Ingemar, say hi. Come on. He's a good friend, really, that got this started. So I was browsing at the table display he had, and he came by and asked me what all publishers ask: have you ever thought about writing a book? And that got a conversation started. And then, again, with Joy's encouragement, decided to devote the next year to rewriting it, to make it consistent, because it kind of evolved as I went on to be suitable for a book. And so that's how this project actually got started. And what made it exciting for me personally was that as a pastor, my world is sort of the territory between the world of scholarship, those wonderful men and women who devote their lives to linguistic studies and history and theology, to as much as possible really understand how the original hearers of the Bible would have understood it within their own time and culture. Because we're reading a book, as one person said, that was written for us, but not written to us. As 21st century people, we're listening to a conversation that ancient Near Eastern people would have heard and responded to within their understanding of things. And so the world of scholarship looks at that and tries to make sense of what they would have heard and how they would have understood it within their own time and place. And then the role of pastors in local congregations is to take the wonderful work they do and translate that into the language and experience of everyday folks in the local congregation. So that's what pastors try to do. Whether we do it successfully or not, all the time, I'm not sure. But it's for me, it's a very joyful thing to do. And so as I got into writing this, I realized that in some ways, this was a way for me to invest all of the thought I've been given to these things for 42 years, since I was ordained back in '76, to maybe provide a tool for people who would really like to understand the Bible better and connect the dots, but just gave up because it was too difficult or confusing to them. Or also, as I say, for those that might be curious about the Bible. Because the fact is, the Bible is, since the development of the printing press, is the top-selling book in the world. It still is every year. In the U.S., there's 25 million copies of the Bible sold every year, and overseas, in part and in whole, another 200 million copies. So it continues to be the most influential book ever written. And yet, in our time, just because of the shifting cultural prejudices of our postmodern time, a lot of people have sort of lost track of the story. Many people, if you're an older generation, grew up in Sunday school, but there's a whole generation now of kids that know nothing whatsoever about the Bible and stories. And I was just thinking about this and trying to find a title for it, and I came across a wonderful book called The Hidden Bestseller, Searching for the Bible in America. And the journalists travel all over the United States talking to Christians about the Bible in all different sized churches, big and small, different parts of the country, theologically liberal, theologically conservative, to pastors and teachers and professors about the Bible and what they thought about it and their experience with it. And he concludes that to a large degree, though the Bible is still a widespread bestseller, many of the times it just ends up as kind of an icon on the bookshelf that people don't read. If they have it, maybe you have 2 or 3 of them on your shelves, but we don't read them. And for all the reasons we talked about, it's a difficult book. And so I linked to an interview with this author. He was saying that though he was discouraged about the fact that for the most part people had forgotten the teaching of the Bible and its stories and characters, he was hopeful that it could possibly be rediscovered. And so that set the light bulb off in my mind, and thus the title of the book, Rediscover the Bible, Rediscovering the First Time. So that is kind of how it came to be and why it has been for me such a wonderful experience. And it's in a way been, in my old age, a renewal of faith and to engage the God of the Bible. And to do so honestly, because there's a lot in the Bible that's hard to understand. It's sometimes shocking, sometimes offensive, sometimes it seems boring to us. And I tried to write this book in a way to just let the Bible tell its own story. And so I didn't write it with a particular specific agenda to convince you of a certain way of thinking about it, although I certainly do have my own way of thinking about it. So I tried to be objective, is within my own frame of reference, but since I take the Bible as God's Word to us, I was writing it from the point of view of faith and wanting to listen to what it says to me and to our time, and I as a pastor, what is the kind of things I need to say to the congregation. So it has been a wonderful experience, and meeting Ingebar and so many others along the way, which is totally unexpected. and being here today like this, totally unexpected. I just feel so blessed by it, and am thankful to Joy for her encouragement all the way through. I had a wonderful editor in this process who's read this book more times than I have. That's Beth, back there. Beth Cockrell, wave your hand. She was fantastic, put way more work into this than I would have expected, to, as much as possible, make sure that the nouns and verbs are correct. I had literally hundreds and hundreds of Bible references, and so she had to check every single one of them to make sure they were right. And she caught a lot of my mistakes. So thank you, Beth, and others, who weighed in and helped me. And then these books here at the store have on the back the reviews from the peer reviews that I asked for, and these friends, colleagues, people I've met along the way were very generous, and I really am grateful to them as well for their encouragement. So, now finally in a nutshell, what am I doing in the book? I know that a lot of people like to read devotional books, which are daily readers that don't take too much time. They usually have a prayer at the end. And if you go over to the religious section of Christianity in Barnes & Noble, you'll see there's a lot of these kind of devotional books. And but most of the time, they're written like this verse here or that verse there, and just sort of random thoughts throughout the day. And there wasn't really anything I could tell. I researched this quite a bit. It actually took you through the whole Bible, every chapter of the Bible, in that kind of format as a daily reader. So each day is about 800 or 900 words. It takes about 15 minutes if you read it slowly to go through it. But that follows, in my case, it follows the format of the Daily Walk Bible New Living Translation that I was using. And so day 1, or January 1, however you want to start it, is Genesis 1 and 2. Day 2, or January 2, is Genesis 3 to 5, and so forth, all the way through the Bible to Revelation. And so my hope was for myself, as well as for the reader, was to help people understand, first of all, how the original hearers might have understood what was being written. And so, for example, one of the more controversial questions is, what about Genesis 1 and 2 and modern science today? Are they in conflict with each other? And understanding that ancient Near Eastern people had no concept of modern science as we know it, they were asking very different questions than we ask. They could have cared less about the things that we care about, but they had their own kind of questions. And so the book of Genesis is written for them. As it turns out, the God that is presented and the creation that is talked about in Genesis 1 and 2 as a product not of random chance but of loving purpose and an orderly world that is understandable by human reason, by creatures like us created in God's image. The probability of science as a discipline emerging is very, very likely. And indeed, modern science did arise out of a biblical view of reality, that this world is purposeful and understandable, intelligible, and so forth. So there's all those wonderful things to talk about. But the big story is what I was concerned about. What is the Bible trying to say? I think if I were to summarize it in a single word, what the Bible is about is Jesus. Everything is moving towards God entering into his own creation, putting on a skin and bones to be able to present himself and converse with us face to face. God, our Creator, infinite in his being, reduces himself to come and talk with us face to face to tell us how much he loves us, that he forgives us for our rebellion against him, which is what the Bible is a lot about, and wants to enter into relationship with us forever. That this life, our mortal life, is just the pre-season, if you will, to what's ahead. in the new creation, the new heavens and new earth. So, just to conclude by saying that I take the four big themes of the Bible: creation, where did everything come from, why are we here, what does it mean to be human? Fall, if the world is good and we're in God's image, why is the world so messed up? Why am I so messed up? Redemption, what if anything is God going to do about it? And finally, new creation, where's this all leading to? And so I try to keep those four big ideas in mind all the way through and connect the dots with them. And I hope that if you read all the way through it, that the end of it will be not only that you have a better, more confident understanding of the big ideas. That's not to say I have all the answers, because I really don't, but I hope it's a faithful representation of the message of the Bible, and that will encourage you to get back into the text for yourself and read Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy all the way through, and just get all this there, because it's not possible to even summarize all that's there in simply 800 or 900 words a day. There's just so much there. So each day, and this is the last thing I'm going to talk about, each day begins as a summary of a number of chapters. So again, day 1 is a summary or paraphrase of Genesis 1 and 2. I have like a key verse, a verse that comes from those chapters that expresses a big idea within those stories. And then I do a lot of things in the summary, try to tell the story, give some background information that might be useful, make some observations. I try to imagine how you feel about what you're reading, because sometimes it's like, are you kidding me? This is, what is this? And try to react and feel as you would feel. And because as we see, the Bible is not this magic story about perfect people, like, you would see like a mythical heroes and heroines who don't have problems and, who achieve these mighty things. It's a real down-to-earth, gritty, uncomfortable story about flawed human beings who do some terrible things, and in the process of that discover this God who loves them anyway, and who is absolutely determined not to let the human race get away from him. And so you see this going on all the way through, and then at the end of each day, I have a little paragraph called Focus, and that just takes an idea from that particular day's reading and zeroes in on it a bit. And finally, a prayer that you might pray or use as a basis of a prayer about what's said in that day. And so that's how it's laid out and structured. And I thought if you would indulge me, I would give you a sample of a day's reading. And then secondly, every 7 days, and this follows the New Living Translation format. There's a page called Reflection, and that looks at the weeks of readings and takes a big issue there, and I spend the whole time on it. Because there's plenty of questions that people have about the Bible. And so that's when I use those times to try to drill in on those things. So if I may, I'll read, first of all, one day's reading, and I've chosen the first day of the book of Esther in the Old Testament. And Esther is one of my favorite books in the Old Testament, because it's amazing storytelling. And it takes place, actually, historically, at the very end of the Old Testament. Because if you've read the Old Testament before, you may know that after Abraham has many children and they become the sons of Abraham, or the tribe eventually ends up in Egypt, and they get taken across the Red Sea into the land of Canaan to occupy the land that God had promised them. Those people, they're there for this time, and they have a really hard time staying connected with God, and find themselves constantly lured back into the world from which they came, just like we do today. We face the same temptations. that God warned them, you have to stay connected with me or else consequences will follow of your own doing, and eventually that's what happens. All of Israel is conquered by pagan nations around them, and many of the Jews are taken into exile in Persia, Assyria, Babylonia. This takes place at that time. Terrible devastation, terrible discouragement. The people of Israel wonder, has God given up on us? Is the story over with? Have we blown it so badly that God's finally said, no way? And of course, we know that's not true. And Esther is a story of an incredible woman who experiences something that we're talking about as a culture today, and that is sexual abuse by men. It's a very contemporary story in that regard. But she is presented as a woman of great character and faith who is worthy of our respect and emulation. And so here's how that story begins. Not all exiled Jews chose to go back to Jerusalem. Some were able to do that because the pagan kings allowed them to do so. In fact, only about 50,000 of all of those dispersed in the nations returned, a remnant of faith. Most were reluctant to return to the Promised Land and stayed in Persia because after 70 years it now seems like home. The story of Esther takes place among those who stayed in Persia. Her remarkable story shows that God is present to protect and bless his people, even in a foreign land, even when it seems far away from God. The story begins at a banquet thrown by King Xerxes, who, for his nobles and officials, has quite a celebration. It lasts 180 days. Yeah. A tremendous display of the opulent wealth of his empire and the pomp and splendor of his majesty, quote unquote. Following the banquet for his nobles and officials is a banquet for all the common people, from the greatest to the least. And Xerxes' queen, Queen Vashti, gives a banquet for the women in the royal palace of the king. And after all of this partying and a whole lot of wine, the king, Xerxes, is in high spirits. On a whim, he commands that Queen Vashti be summoned because he wants all the men to jealously gaze upon her beauty, for she was a very beautiful woman. In other words, this is my hot wife, all you guys, aren't you jealous? Well, there's nothing more flattering to a woman than being displayed as the object of male lust, right? Not surprisingly, the queen refuses. So the king, being denied this opportunity to show off his trophy wife, is furious. And hell hath no fury like a narcissistic king who's being scorned. So Xerxes, shall we say Jerxes, summons his advisors to determine a suitable penalty for a queen who refuses to obey. The advisors, of course, are outraged. They say Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king, but also every noble and citizen throughout our empire. Women everywhere will begin to despise their husbands when they learn that Queen Vashti has refused to appear before the king. Before this day out, the wives of all the king's nobles throughout Persia and Media will hear what the queen did and start treating their husbands the same way. There will be no end. There'll be no end to their contempt and anger. What a terrible crisis for the men. So, at his advisor's advice, Xerxes issues a written decree, a law of the Medes and the Persians. I don't know if you've ever heard that phrase, the law of the Medes and the Persians. This is where it comes from. It's a decree that cannot be revoked, that Queen Vashti will be forever banished from the king's presence, so that a, quote, more worthy, that is, more controllable, queen may be found. So the king's eunuchs, those guys you can trust around beautiful women, search the empire and assemble a royal harem of beautiful young virgins more beautiful than, and none more beautiful than a young Jewish woman named Esther. Her cousin Mordecai has raised her here in Persia after her parents' death, and he has instructed her not to tell anyone of her nationality or background as an exiled Jew. All the women that are gathered from the kingdom are given 12 months of special diets and beauty treatments. Great grand makeover. But Esther stands out from the group. She's given additional pampering, 7 maids to serve her, and the best room in the harem. And without going into the creepy details, Esther is brought to the king, like the rest of the girls, for a test drive. Xerxes is enthralled with Esther and requests that she visit a second time in his private room. Despite this dehumanizing process, Esther manages to keep her dignity and composure. And so, quote, the king loved Esther more than any of the other young women. He was so delighted with her that he set the royal crown on her head and declared her queen instead of Vashti. As queen, Esther continues to keep her nationality and family identity a secret. Meanwhile, her cousin Mordecai is providentially made a palace official and is able thereafter to secretly advise her. One day, Mordecai overhears an assassination plot by 2 of Xerxes' guards. Mordecai tips off Queen Esther, who tells the king, who gives Mordecai credit. The book of Esther is noteworthy for the fact that God is not mentioned outright. It's the only book in the Bible where God is not outright mentioned. But he's seen to be providentially at work throughout the story, controlling events by strategically positioning his people for a critical moment that is soon to come. And then the focus. All who have experienced sexual exploitation and harassment will cringe with empathy for Esther, who gets caught up in the king's wrath, lust, and abuse of power. Unfortunately, these kinds of stories happen all the time in the fallen world. Yet even here in the dark shadows of lust and sexual abuse, God is at work to bring dignity and freedom to the exploited. And as we shall see, justice to those who do evil. And then the prayer, Lord, thank you again for the reminder that you see all things, even the darkest affairs of men and nations. Thank you for the assurance that you are at work in all things for the good of those that love you and are called according to your purposes, like Esther. The story of Esther reminds us and encourages us to remain strong and faithful to you, even as we are caught in situations that we have no power to avoid. Amen. So that is kind of an example of the paraphrasing of the story.
In the summary?
The summary of the story, of those chapters, and then trying to draw some thoughts from it that can connect with our world today, kind of how we experience life. Because I think, in fact, someone was telling me they were reading it, they couldn't believe how little life has changed from what we read in the Bible. And in that sense, when we read the Bible, it has a ring of truth to it. It reads us as much as we read it. And it makes sense. It's not a fairy tale or a magical story because it really connects with the human spirit and with life as we know it. And it's one of the reasons why it has this self-authenticating nature about it that draws people to the story and opens our heart to hear the good news that it's about, which is, despite the darkness and brokenness of this world, there's a God who loves us and is pursuing us to win us over through Jesus so that we can be connected with him. So that kind of flavor is sort of what I tried to maintain through the reading of the book. And I won't I've been talking here a long time now, so I won't read the second one, but every 7 days there's a reflection on some issue that, for example, the case I was thinking of was the problem of evil. How do we understand that in light of a good God? Questions like that arise, and we try to address them also.
And you're the answer.
I'm the answer.
See,
I'm the problem of evil.
have time for
Yes, Q&A.
Now I've noticed the size of that book. You could put the whole Bible in a book that size. Have you written the whole Bible in there?
No.
These are just a series of paraphrases.
Yes, I quote the Bible like from the text. The Bible is like 1,500 pages. just the text of the Bible, I think, most Bibles.
Uh-huh.
This is 700 pages.
Okay. A little smaller than that.
Yeah, so it does summarize the story. So if you actually read the chapters that are referred to, you'll find there's more detail there. Like I may summarize a number of paragraphs by a sentence or two. And that's why I encourage you, the best way to read the book is by also reading the text along with it. But that might be too much for someone to start. And so the reading standalone, you don't actually have to read the text to
You don't
make
have
sense.
to read the Bible along with this then.
No, not to make use of it.
We can read through this then.
Yes. And hopefully that will encourage you to want to read the Bible, the full text itself. Yeah. Other questions? Any hecklers?
Where will this be on the shelf? Is this going to be like the devotionals? Or
Well, where they have put it, there's a display right around the corner called Local Authors Display, and that's one place. And then another place is back in the Bible section, I've noticed, on the
so
top.
with the Bibles, where the Bibles
Actually are.
okay.
This book
I
is.
was looking around to see if I could see it on the shelf. I wasn't sure if it was on there yet or not.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about putting it into the other section where the devotionals are, because I think that's
It's more
another way you would find this. Yeah,
good way to use it.
yeah, as a devotional. Yeah. I have been leading a group of about 10 in a group study of this, and I'm to see how it works as a study like that. It's been really exciting. So once a week we get together, and we've done 7 days of reading, and we talk about those things, kind of the big ideas that are there, and just kind of and reflect upon what it's saying in our own world today. And it's been really worked well for that. And so that's something you might consider, those of you in Bible studies.
You were talking before you started. Are you thinking of maybe putting anything on it?
Yes, it's very expensive to do so, so we're going to have to
Yes, to sell a few of these. First.
have to sell a few.
But there will be also an ebook coming very soon
An ebook will be coming soon.
on the Nook as well.
Oh, on the Nook, good. Okay.
Yeah, on the Kindle too. Like on all
Kindle and Nook. And we're sort of playing around with an idea of doing a, we haven't talked about it in great depth yet, but of doing a daily email subscription. So you could very affordably, if you would rather have a page a day come to your smartphone, let's say, and that would be easier for you than, say, having a DVD to put in your car, or if you don't have a Nook reader, then that might be something too we think about. Alexa, yeah, that's a good idea. Any other questions? Well, wow, thank you so much, you guys, for coming down. This really means a lot to me. I'm very encouraged to see old friends from 3 different churches. And I'm happy the reason I'm here, of course, is to sign books, either ones that you brought with you or ones that you may want to purchase. So we'll do that, and if you have any personal questions, we can answer those as well. Yes?
If we buy the book, we get a discount on the ebook.
Oh, sure, why not?
You need to buy it first before you sign it, or can you sign it and we go buy it?
Good question.
I think
probably
you
gonna
can,
buy it.
sign it first. That's fine.
Sure.
I'm just making that decision right now. I think that's fine. So, yeah.
Now you're gonna go buy this stuff?